Good afternoon, everybody. We'd just like to say thank you very, very much for attending this early engagement webinar for the proposed Unlocking Space for Business SBRI from the UK Space Agency. Just to inform you that the webinar will be recorded. So the recording has already started and the recording will be made available after the webinar for anybody who has been unable to attend. During the webinar, we'd like to invite you to submit any questions that you have using the Q&A function, which you should find at the top of your screen. And we will be taking time for Q&A at the end of the webinar. And just to introduce ourselves and who we are on the call today, my name is Laura. I'm the project lead for the Unlocking Space for Business project within the UK Space Agency. I'm joined by Ruby, who is our project officer, Miles and Chris from our commercial team in the UK Space Agency, Henry from our evidence team, and Tom from Innovate UK UKRI, who's going to talk to us about SBRIs in general. Just to very quickly run through what we're going to be talking about on this webinar today. If we could move to the next slide, thank you, Ruby. We've got an overview from Tom about small business research initiatives, SBRIs, what they are and how it applies here in this case in the proposed SBRI that we're putting forward from the UK Space Agency. We've then got an overview of the UK Space for Business, Unlocking Space for Business, programme, which is being run by the UK Space Agency, and the proposed SBRI competition. And then there's time for Q&A at the end. And I think just to be very clear from the offset, the details of this proposed SBRI are subject to change following any feedback that we receive after this webinar. So we would very much welcome your questions throughout the webinar and also any feedback that you have on the proposed SBRI to our email address after the webinar. And we will make that very clear at the end what the email address is if you'd like to take that down. So I will hand over to Tom to give us an introduction as to SBRIs, and then we will talk more about the proposed SBRI. Tom, over to you.
Thanks very much for that. Hi, everyone. I'm Tom Dawes. So I work in the government levers team at Innovate UK. We focus on government's use of procurement, regulations and standards to support the research and innovation ecosystem. I'm just going to give you a bit of background on SBRI in general and talk through a few of its key features. Next slide, please. So SBRI was developed in the early 2000s by the European Commission as a way to fund R&D that more equally shared benefits and risks between funders and successful applicants, and it wasn't a subsidy, and therefore it's less distortive to the market than a grant-based approach. They called it pre-commercial procurement, and that was implemented in the UK as SBRI. And Innovate UK act as a custodians of that mechanism, supporting other public sector organisations to use it, as well as collecting data on its use across the UK on behalf of central government. It's worth noting that SBRI is mentioned specifically in the UK Science and Technology Framework, along with a Cabinet Office commitment to expand its use across the public sector. Next slide, please. So since that implementation in the UK, there's been well over £1.5 billion worth invested through SBRI competitions. And there was an independent evaluation published last year that's available on the UKRI website. You should be able to search for it easily, any good search engine. If you're interested in finding out a bit more, it shows, it demonstrates the benefits. It also includes quantitative analysis, some of which shows that there are benefits to successful applicants between 1.5 and 4 times the value of the public sector investment. And there are, again, just as an example, projected future savings of around 1.5 billion as a result of SBRIs, which have taken place in the health sector alone. Next slide, please. So SBRI is pre-commercial procurement. It wouldn't be used where a commercially available solution already exists. It's used to procure research and development services to develop solutions to government challenges, either operational or policy challenges, and focus on specific outcome-driven solutions. So it's challenge-led innovation, essentially. It does require a lead customer or the knowledge that there would be a market for this if the solution were to exist. The funder isn't necessarily the end customer. For example, Innovate UK often fund R&D through SBRIs, and we won't ever be the end customer who puts that solution into action. Some funders, for example, the Ministry of Defence, they use SBRI and they are both the funder and often the end customer as well, so it can vary. And running an SBRI in no way commits the funding organisation to purchase the solutions if that was developed through the SBRI, although that's obviously what we'd want to see in the longer term, someone putting these solutions into practice to help solve that government challenge, and that's how we get the impact from the research and development. It is important to recognise that purchasing and use of the solution is a stage on and separate from the SBRI itself. And the challenges and outcomes need to be relatively well defined to the extent that applicants are clear what they're aiming for. The mechanism is very flexible as to the granularity of that challenge. So just as a couple of quick examples, last year, NHS in Wales ran a challenge on repetitive strain injury in one particular type of ear, nose and throat surgery. And at the same time, or slightly later, the Welsh Government ran a challenge around solving the sustainability of food supply in Wales. So the challenges can be very different levels of granularity, but always it needs to be fairly well defined so applicants know what they're aiming for. And SBRI's focus on usable solutions often helps coalesce and so get buy-in from the wider system, for example, end users. And you'll also notice on this page and from the introduction earlier that an acronymed SBRI is the Small Business Research Initiative. That is a bit of a misleading name for the mechanism, which I can only apologise for currently. If you're listening from an organisation that isn't a small business, don't panic. All organisation sizes and types are eligible to apply as per normal public sector procurement rules. The misleading name is something that we're in the process of addressing at the moment. Next slide, please. So I'll briefly just go over some of the key features of SBRI. As mentioned earlier, they are awarded as contracts, not grants. And unlike grants, they are 100% funded rather than requiring match funding. As you'd expect for any contract, payments are made on completion of milestones, which are bespoke for each project. And payments can be reasonably reduced, delayed or withheld if milestones are not met. Again, as you'd sort of expect for any standard procurement. Costs quoted should reflect fair market value, be actual costs and not include profit. Contracts are with a single organisation, the lead applicant, and the lead applicant may choose to subcontract where there's justification for doing so. The lead applicant should do the majority of the work, and they must also, or they do also remain accountable for delivering on the deliverables set out in the contract. Arrangements with subcontractors are also the responsibility of the lead applicant. Now, there are some clauses in the contract around IP. All IP does rest with the supplier. There are some usage rights for foreground IP granted to the funder. They're all set out in the draft contract, and nothing in the contract affects background IP. Those clauses are as developed by the European Commission, although we've done some work recently just to make the wording a bit clearer. They were designed to share the benefits and risks so that this is not a subsidy. The clause essentially ensures that the funder does not pay royalties for a product or service they may wish to procure at a later stage, which they've funded 100% of the development costs for. Again, this only covers IP developed during the project. And if there were any future procurement of a solution by the funder, we'd expect to see relevant costs for background IP, along with operational costs, and profit included in any future procurement. And all organisations are very much encouraged to plan to exploit that IP and explore future implementation opportunities beyond the funding organisation as part of the SBRI, where this clause is unlikely to have relevance. We've had over 6,500 contracts issued to SBRIs, many of which have gone on to win public sector contracts, some for multi-million-pound procurements with the funder themselves, and we've never had an organisation come back to us and say these clauses were detrimental to them. We've only had positive feedback from applicants involved. And as I covered earlier, it's a procurement for a contract by a public sector, so it is open to any size and type of organisation, although all applicants must demonstrate a route to market. Next slide, please. And just very briefly to finish off, the yellow pre-commercial procurement section on this diagram is what a sort of textbook SBRI would look like. The mechanism is very flexible, so it can start or end anywhere along that TRL 2 to 8 spectrum. Generally, there'll be a greater number of smaller projects at earlier stages of development through to a smaller number of larger projects at later stages. This is only an example, and I think I'll leave it there for Space Agency colleagues to take you through this competition in more detail.
Super, thank you very much, Tom. We will now head over to talk a little bit more about the proposed SBRI and the Unlocking Space for Business programme. So if we move on to the next slide, the Unlocking Space for Business programme has come about as the UK Space Agency has identified that there's a greater opportunity for businesses to use satellite data and services in their business operations. Currently, we know that satellite data and services underpin over 17% of UK GDP, and there are many new innovations which are coming out of satellite data and services, which we believe there is an opportunity for businesses to use and make better use of. There are 3 domains that the programme is looking at, so satellite imagery, satellite connectivity and communications, and position, navigation and timing as well. If we move on to the next slide, the Unlocking Space for Business programme is looking to encourage businesses to take up and realise these benefits of satellite data and services. So there's 3 key things that the programme is trying to support businesses to do. The first is to better understand those innovations in satellite data and services and how they could be combined with existing complementary or terrestrial data sources. The second thing is to connect up leading data suppliers, aggregators or integrators with potential end users through a series of networking events. And the third is to provide an opportunity for government funding to support the delivery of these benefits from satellite data and services, which is what we're talking about today. If you've already been on the gov.uk website and seen the Unlocking Space for Business programme slides on there, and you may already recognise some of these slides, and those are taken from a wider information pack that is available on gov.uk. If we move on to the next slide, this sets out the 5 proposed initiatives that the Unlocking Space for Business programme intends to deliver. So the first is an information hub. So this is information including insights for businesses on how they can unlock value from satellites, and again, providing them with examples of existing activity worldwide. So this is what we've started to deliver on the gov.uk with these slides and other information which is currently available there. The second are the insight and networking events that I mentioned just previously, and these are currently being set up with 2 upcoming networking events, one for financial services and one for transport and logistics, which are the 2 key sectors that we're targeting with this programme of work. The third is a series of exploration workshops, which are provided to end users as an opportunity for them to talk through and understand what the potential areas for integrating satellite data services into their business could be for them. The fourth, is a learning and development project within our programme, where end users can learn from a range of different experts about the value of satellite data and services to support that decision making within their business. And finally, we have the funding call, which this SBRI is proposed to be part of, to fund organisations to support the development of new satellite data and services innovations combined with terrestrial data and technology. So if we move on to the next slide, please, we'll talk a bit more about the proposed SBRI competition here today. And again, this comes with the caveat that this is the proposed SBRI competition, which is subject to change following any feedback we receive after this webinar. The proposed competition intends to fund innovative feasibility studies, fusing together terrestrial data sources with satellite data and services within one of two target sectors, transport and logistics and financial services. The proposed total available amount of funding is £2 million, inclusive of VAT, and the proposed total maximum value for each contract is £200,000, inclusive of VAT. We are currently proposing that the length of the contracts are up to 6 months long, and we're proposing to fund up to 10 feasibility study R&D contracts, research and development contracts. If we move on to the next slide, this gives a little bit more information about the proposed approach for this SBRI. So we are proposing that projects should involve one or more of those 3 commercial satellite data and services domains that I mentioned earlier. So satellite imagery or Earth observation, satellite connectivity and communications, or position, navigation and timing. We're proposing that projects should cover one of those satellite domains, but they can cover more of those domains if they wish. Projects should also focus on prioritising the 4 bullet points on the slide, so new revenue growth opportunities, improved customer experiences, operational efficiencies, and environmental, social and governance or ESG benefits. We're also proposing that the projects may combine terrestrial data and services, so for example, but not limited to AI, quantum, machine learning, drones, geospatial data, with satellite data and services. If we move on to the next slide, this is our proposed approach for what organisations would be eligible to apply for an SBRI. We're proposing that organisations who would be eligible would be an organisation of any size. So as Tom mentioned earlier, SBRI, despite the name, is not limited to small businesses. We're proposing that organisations of any size can apply. There would need to be one lead organisation applying to lead this project, but that organisation might be able to work alone, or they may also be able to work with businesses, research organisations, etc. as subcontractors. So there would be one individual organisation applying for the SBRI. They must have a valid UK bank account, and they must be able to provide reporting against the UK Space Agency's North Star metric, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail later on in this webinar. And they must be able to provide evidence and data on a monthly reporting cycle to support the monitoring and evaluation activities. They must also be available for interview and survey by the monitoring and evaluation delivery partners for the Unlocking Space for Business programme. And you'll also see at the top there that whilst this is not a requirement, we're encouraging applications from organisations who've not extensively used satellite data and services before. We could move on to the next slide, please. So this is the proposed approach currently for projects that would potentially be in scope of receiving this SBRI funding and could apply for the SBRI funding. So projects must be ready to commence by January 2024 and deliver at least one key milestone by March 2024. And as mentioned a couple of slides previous to this, they must be completed within 6 months. We're also stipulating that projects proposals for projects must identify the primary target sector, which can be either transport and logistics or financial services. But we recognise there may be crossover for projects that cover both, and the proposed approach is that we would ask those proposed projects or those proposals to set out which is the key target sector that the project is aimed and focusing on. Proposals must also demonstrate a credible and a practical route to market, noting that at this stage the proposed projects we would be funding would be feasibility studies, and they must also detail the intended customer groups, integrators and suppliers who would be involved in that feasibility study. If we could move on to the next slide, please, Ruby. So this is the proposed list of of projects which would not be in scope of applying for this SBRI funding. So just very briefly picking out a few of these, we would not be looking to fund projects which are duplicating existing work, are currently being funded elsewhere in the UK Space Agency or the wider UK government, and we would also not be looking to fund projects that do not demonstrate significant support and engagement from potential customers in either of those two specified target sector areas, so transport and logistics or financial services sectors. And if we move on just to the final few slides here about the proposed approach, this is the proposed indicative timeline for the SBRI phase. So we're proposing that the SBRI opens this Friday, the 17th of November. We're also proposing that following this early engagement webinar, we would host a separate webinar once the SBRI has opened, which would be very similar in approach, putting out the proposed, rather than the proposed SBRI, the finalised SBRI in that webinar, and providing an opportunity for Q&A. The proposed close date is the 15th of December of this year, with applicants notified by the end of this year and contracts awarded from January 2024. So I'll hand over very briefly to Henry to talk us through the proposed project reporting.
Yes, so UKSA needs to provide monitoring and evaluation as part of all projects it funds. So Unlocking Space for Business is one of those. So we're asking successful applicants to provide evidence and data as part of monthly reporting cycle in support of these M&E activities. That may include things like insights into any revenue generation, any job creation, or any cost savings that are resulting from the project. Applicants or successful applicants must be available for interview and survey by our M&E delivery partners, which we have contracts out. And that will be required throughout the project and for a period of time following its conclusion as well, so that we can track the success of the project beyond the end of the project. And it's also worth mentioning the UK Space Agency's North Star metric. So this is the agency's a primary success metric that we use to measure the success of projects in terms of the investments that is catalysed as a result of the UKSA funding. So we will be providing an annex attached to the applications, which we'll be asking all applicants to fill out, and that will be made clear. Very clear within the annex what we'll be asking you to do, but it will just be an indicative forecast for the amount of investment or private sector investment that you expect to result from this funding. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. Just a reminder, if anybody would like to submit any Q&A, then we're coming to the end of the content part of this webinar, and we'd be very happy to take Q&A after this. So finally, if we move on just to the next slide, what happens next? So as I mentioned, this is the proposed approach for this SBRI. So we would be very grateful for any feedback following this webinar. Given the timescales that we've set out, the indicative timescales, we'd be grateful for feedback by tomorrow at 2 p.m. And the proposed timescales moving forward are that the SBRI would open on this Friday with all documentation available on Contracts Finder. As mentioned, we're proposing that we hold an additional webinar event following that SBRI being published on the 30th of November. And we're also proposing that the applications should be submitted by Friday, the 15th of December. Once applications are submitted, and all the detail on submitting applications will be in the documentation on Contracts Finder. A selected panel of assessors will review all of the applications and score applications. Applicants will be notified of the outcome and will be provided with feedback. And contracts then will be issued to all successful applicants, with projects due to start from January 2024. So that brings us to the end of the content on this proposed SBRI approach. But we're very happy to answer questions, and I believe we've got a couple of questions have come through. So first question that's come through, and I might come to some of my colleagues for some of these questions on reporting and terms and conditions. The first question that's come through is, are you able to circulate the slides following the webinar? So yes, we can ensure that everybody who signed up to the webinar receives a copy of the slides. So we'll do that after this webinar is finished. The next question is on reporting. So Henry, if it's okay, I'll come to you on this. So the question is, does the monthly reporting need to be in a particular format? And how much time as an estimate do you think we should aim to allocate as part of the interview and survey? And I'm assuming that's the interview and survey by the M&E partner. So Henry, over to you.
Sure. So the format, it will be quite straightforward, and we'll provide a template for you. So essentially, the format will be made clear in that template. So it should be pretty straightforward. In terms of an estimate for time, we're currently in the design process for how we're going to engage with successful applicants. So that might include interviews and surveys, but may also include a bit of follow-up engagement as well. But I would expect in the first instance an interview to be around an hour, and a survey to be around 30 minutes. But those are subject to changes. We're currently in the design phase for those.
Great, thank you for that, Henry. OK, so the next question is around terms and conditions. So which terms and conditions apply for successful applicants? UKRI terms. So Chris, if I could come to you on that, and then Tom, if you have anything else you'd like to add, please do come in.
Yeah, sure. There is a set contract for SBRIs, which we are using Innovate UK's template essentially, and we're working off that. That will be shared as part of the core documents that go up onto Contracts Finder, so it should be available for review once the competition is live.
Yeah, the only thing I'd quickly add to that is that they are the same terms and conditions for all SBRIs used across the UK, so they've been used many times in the past as well.
Great, thank you both. OK, the next question is there an assessment or scoring system to make the choice of project to green light? And is this available so that we can understand the weighting given, etc.? So yes, there is, alongside the competition brief, which will be uploaded with the SBRI documentation, there's also an evaluation criteria, and this sets out what the different weighting for the different questions which are set out in the competition brief, and it will also set out what a good application would look like. So that provides some more detail on how those questions are weighted and assessed. OK, there's another question here on the North Star metric. So Henry, I'll come to you for that. Two questions actually, if I can join them together. What is reported via the North Star metric, and what are the metrics? So that's the first question. And then the second question is, can you provide a link to more information on the North Star metric and how you use it?
Yes, so there are four main things that are reported as part of North Star metrics. So we've got matched funding. So any match funding that would usually be attached to grant type funding that we do. So that won't apply in this case. But essentially any revenue generated or any further follow-on contract or grants that may result or may directly or indirectly result from this activity or from this contract, but also any follow-on private sector investments that you think you can attribute to this activity into this contract and to this program is essentially what we're looking at in this case. In terms of what we use it for, so we don't use it really at a contract level. We aggregate the data and use it and take it together alongside all our other programs to provide evidence on overall catalyzed investments as a result of all the programs that the agency funds. So it's an agency-wide metric. So essentially, we aggregate that data, and it's of interest to, for example, to ask our supporting government departments, and we're going to use it to help design future programs as well, and to help us prioritize programs as an agency. So it's at a kind of higher level in terms of how we design our programs.
Great, thank you very much for that, Henry. There are another two questions which I will put together and answer. So the first is, what was the UK Space Agency's rationale for focusing on the two chosen sectors, so transport and logistics and financial services, and are there likely to be future competitions for other sectors? So that's the first question. And can you give a definition of financial services as a sector is the second question. So on those two questions, the Unlocking Space for Business programme is a pilot programme of work which the UK Space Agency is undertaking. So it's a very focused 18-month programme of work, and those two sectors were identified as key areas that provided a lot of opportunity for business, and that we identified as an agency as having high opportunity for those businesses in those sectors to increase the use of satellite data and services. So the second part of that question was around, are there likely to be future competitions for other sectors? In this pilot programme, the answer is there are unlikely to be future competitions for other sectors, as we're focusing on those two target sectors for this programme of work. And the second question there was, can you give a definition of financial services as a sector? And we can look within the SBRI guidance and the competition brief that we're providing as to how we can explain what would be considered within financial services, if that is helpful for applicants. I've got two more questions, both sort of a commercial angle. So Miles and Chris, if I could come to you for both of these. The first question is, can an applicant submit multiple applications? And then the second question is, you say that projects are being funded elsewhere by the UK Space Agency or the UK government are not eligible. What about follow-on work from projects that were previously funded? So Miles, Chris, if you're able to provide any insight on those two questions, I will hand over to you now.
Miles, turn his camera. So jump in, Miles, if you think I miss anything off here. So in terms of the first one, can applicants submit multiple applications? The answer is yes, short answer. The longer answer is they need to be subjectively different. So if you submit one application, take it back, change the word financial services to transport and logistics and resubmit it, we will just ignore the second application or whatever application we view to be out of scope of the work. And then the one around funding elsewhere in government, I might look to Miles to answer because it can be a bit complicated.
Yeah, so ideally the aim of this is that we're trying to not duplicate funding, particularly at this kind of lower level pilot, as we're not kind of receiving goods and services. It's kind of a different space from kind of the contract sides that we're used to working in. So if projects are receiving direct funding from some other parts of government, then we wouldn't be looking to fund it under this programme. If you have received funding previously from government but are currently not receiving funding to continue that work, then that's something that we'd probably look at favourably for this programme. But we would kind of want to understand the levels of funding you've had previously and kind of what's continuing with that funding. Like we said, we're not trying to duplicate it. So if there's kind of a pause on that programme, but it's likely to kind of ramp up again, that might be something that we have to take into account in the future. But yes, if you have received it previously, then you are eligible to submit. Hopefully we will make it really clear in the core guidance, kind of covering that eventuality. And we may have to come back and ask a few more questions on that one.
Great, thank you very much both. We have another two questions which have come in. So one question is the insurance sector, including self-insuring entities, covered under your finance sector definition? We are looking at the insurance sector underneath financial services, but as I said before, we will look to make clear in the call documentation what would be considered within financial services as best as we can, and the same with transport and logistics. The second question is around business security in space. So data sharing and communications need protection against attack and espionage. Is this something my team can put forward as part of the SBRI process? I think this is something that we are very happy to take offline and come back to you on. What we're proposing within this SBRI is that any of the proposed projects need to have a positive impact in the transport and logistics or the financial services sectors. And the key part of this SBRI is that combining of existing terrestrial data and services with satellite data and services. So we're happy to take that specific question about data sharing and communications offline and answer that subsequently in a written communication if that is helpful. We're also happy to take feedback, as I mentioned before, following this webinar on the email address which is on the screen at the moment. And finally, we have one more question, which is, if we have any further questions during the application process, who can we contact? Miles and Chris, I'll come to you on this one for questions during the application process.
Yeah, so in terms of that, we'll have a clear contact. Essentially, we're running a clarifications process where any question that's raised will be shared with anybody who's wanting to submit an application. So that'll be done through a central mailbox, possibly the commercial one, but we'll make sure that the details are on there and anybody can access it. And then, as I said, all the information will be shared with kind of anybody who wants to submit a proposal.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so we've reached the end of the Q&A submitted. Just like again to say a very big thank you to everybody who has attended today's webinar and everybody who's watching subsequently. We would very much encourage you to submit any feedback following this webinar to the email address that's currently on screen at the moment. That is unlockingspace4business@ukspaceagency.gov.uk. Any questions that we haven't been able to answer in today's session, we will follow up with separately, and we'll, as also mentioned, we'll make the slides from today's session available to everybody who has signed up for today's session. And we do look forward to receiving feedback following the session today. So we will also make the recording available to anybody who's been able to attend today. But once again, thank you very much for your time and thank you for engaging with this. And we look forward to receiving any applications in due course. Thank you.